Okay, everyone, it's now kick off, but I'll just wait until we've got a few more members online, attendees online rather. Just remind you that all these webinars in this series are recorded and are available on our website. So if there's anything that piqued your interest, you can always go back and revisit one of the webinars in our series. Just wait for a few more people. We have a large group this week. All right, just give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get underway. Okay, I think that's probably about enough time. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining us for what is the second in this webinar series. Probably getting underway, I again note that there are some of you today that are either from New Zealand or operate in the retail sector. So whilst this Q&A series will be drawing upon our Australian experiences with office tenants and the Australian legislation, I remind you that the principles remain relevant to New Zealand and all real estate sectors. Nevertheless, for those of you that do have a retail focus, have a look into our weekly retail Q&A series, which takes place on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Sydney time. Again, details can be found on our website, lpc.com.au. So, my name is Michael Raymond. I am head of LPC's industrial team. I trust everyone is keeping safe and well. I am, and I don't know about you, but I almost feel like a teenager again. Petrol is under $1, I'm not allowed in the pub, and I'm grounded. Anyway, apart from using this series as a forum for my poor dad jokes, I'll also be your host today. My role is threefold. First, to introduce this Q&A series, in which we will focus on the impacts on leases and the workplace post-COVID-19. Second, to introduce the speakers and the panel for this week and the questions they will be answering. And third, to manage the Q&A session at the end of our presentation, although if I do get a good one on the way through, I may pop that in early. So stay focused, panel. In order to maximise the opportunity to respond to your questions, we've brought together a panel of expert tenant advisors and workplace specialists. Julian Caraff, one of our directors specialising in the office sector. Ken Lamb, one of our directors also specialising in the office sector, although secretly he wants to be part of the industrial team. There's me and Rebecca Pelling, our Managing Director of Project Services. Our speakers today, though, will be Julian, who will continue on from last week with part 2 of the question, the revolution of lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19. And then we'll hear from Rebecca, who likewise will continue on with her question from last week, how many people can my workplace accommodate? So next slide, please. The format for our series has been drawn from frequently asked questions we've been receiving from our clients in relation to post-COVID-19 lease and workplace readiness. It's based on our successful weekly Q&A webinars we've been running now for 8 weeks or so for our retail tenant clients. Each week we'll have two expert speakers. They will speak to 2 questions relating to post-COVID impacts on leases and the workplace. We will endeavour to keep the presentation brief to around 20 minutes to allow for 10 minutes at the end for questions. So on the way through, if you do have any questions that come to mind, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and I'll get through as many of those as I can. So I will now hand over to Julian, who will speak to the first question, the revolution of lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Michael. So how do we get leases ready post-COVID? Lpc Cresa have been assisting tenants navigate through COVID in 3 key areas, which is rent relief, dealing with the immediate impact of COVID-19 on the business, and having regard to utilisation. Secondly, lease restructures and lease renewals, and ensuring that future leases are post-COVID ready, or are post-COVID ready. And thirdly, portfolio optimization, where a tenant has more than one premise or multiple premises. If we go to the next slide, please. So the question is the revolution of lease arrangements during and post-COVID-19. And what's the answer to that? The answer is, as I said last week, it's relatively simple. It's about identifying the risks that have occurred or on the back of COVID-19, addressing those risks, identifying them, and then looking to see how we can mitigate that through a transfer to the landlord on those risks, which typically means a greater need for flexibility. Last week, we spoke about the pandemic clause. This week, we're going to be talking about the backdated COVID-19 relief. And then in the weeks to come, we'll be dealing with contraction and termination rights, rent and rent reviews, building performance, and prohibited tenants. Or if we go to the next slide, please. So backdated COVID-19 relief. What I want to preface is LPC is determined to negotiate relief as required under the Code of Conduct on behalf of all our tenants. The backdated COVID-19 relief is relevant where relief negotiations with the landlord have stalled or are stuck and relief isn't coming through. So if I put an example onto that, it is if, for example, ABC Proprietary Limited falls outside of the mandated code, is unable to utilise the premises for its intended purpose, occupancy, combined with a reduction in revenue and potentially increased costs. And that example is where the landlord doesn't provide, the landlord's response is simply that they fall outside of the code and therefore no relief is to be granted. Then what can we do to force and leverage an outcome? So if there's a lease that's due to come up, in this example, if ABC's lease is due to expire in 18 months' time, and they are prepared to consider renewing, then what we would be pushing for is to leverage that renewal, having regard to market conditions and the backdated COVID-19 relief that the steps of which we'll talk through now. So in short, the purpose is where a tenant hasn't been able to obtain relief and the negotiations are stuck, and it's particularly relevant for companies with a turnover of over 50 million. And the ultimate outcome here is to ensure that that relief does come through at a future point in time. And what are those trigger points? So if we look at the steps, step 1, or A in this case, is we need to maintain the need for COVID-19 relief and an agreement, sorry. So making sure that we keep that alive with the landlord and having regard to that good faith outcome that is required by the code. The next step is to ensure that the good faith outcome or agreement is quantified or defined, and that if we look at the mandated code, in many respects, the landlord is involved in relation to this code because of the inability for tenants to utilise the space. If this was a pure downturn, there would probably be no regard to the landlord, but the reality is we are unable to utilise the space for what it was intended, and therefore the landlord's been brought into the equation. The mandated response deals with the mandated tenants that are provided with a minimum relief package, and that's considered to be the minimum good faith outcome. If we look at every other outcome where there is no outcome achieved, what it says is that is not a good faith discussion. So we need to have regard to that principle. We need to communicate the impact to the tenant. So we need to have regard to the tenant's inability to utilise that space for its intended use. Also have regard to the impacts on revenue and increased costs. And it's also worthwhile mentioning or articulating back to the landlord where the tenant has tried to save through potentially reduction in employee wages, as we've seen on multiple examples. The next step is to articulate an acceptable outcome having regard to the good faith principles. So setting that out in writing, what rent reduction is a fair outcome, what component of that is waived versus deferred, what do the terms look like for a deferral of rent? Is it over 24 months as suggested by the code? The recovery period is also relevant. What is an appropriate recovery period and how is that defined? And interestingly, the affected period, the code suggests that it's from, for example, New South Wales, it was regulated from the 23rd of April, but the reality is that the impacts were before that, back in March. So have regard to the affected period. And then what we want to ultimately do is come up with a pot or a sum of relief that we're seeking to have to include in future discussions. So if we then look at identifying the triggers for an agreement, is we know that we're stuck in relation to the current discussions during COVID, but what are some of the triggers which allow us to get some greater leverage? And the obvious one is the lease expiry, which was the example I gave earlier, is using that to leverage an outcome, having regard to market conditions at, whether it's in 10 months or 12 months time, plus the backdated relief that we've now quantified. Other opportunities are contraction and early termination rights, which can be used as leverage. And ultimately, the triggers are really about leverage. Then we need to negotiate that outcome and have some regard to the cash flow problems that the landlord might have. So the outcome may be rent reductions, or it may also be a deferral of an outcome. For example, a nil make good at lease end. And then ultimately we need to document that and have that clearly documented going forward. I'll now hand back to Michael.
Thank you, Julian. That was dangerous because a question has popped up and I did suggest that you should stay on your toes, but perhaps I'll give you a quick one now.
Sure.
So the question is, in relation to rent relief that is deferred, what is a reasonable recovery period before the repayment commences?
Yep, okay. So we're hearing a whole heap of different things. Our view is that the recovery period has to have regard to your individual circumstance. So if your business is forecasting slow recovery, then you need to have regard to that. It's not just a matter of JobKeeper, for example, coming to an end. So very much look at the longer term, what your forecast is for recovery.
Okay, very good, thank you. Now, we'll hand over to Rebecca, who sprinted from a previous meeting to make it here in time. So I hope she's recovered and ready to get underway. Rebecca?
Thank you, Michael. So, can everyone see me? Yes? Great. So, the question that I'm answering today is a continuation from last week, which is how many people can my workplace accommodate? So at Lpc Cresa, we've been treating the COVID-19 workplace readiness in threefold. Firstly, we look at the people, the place, and the protocols, and we apply that to this question. In particular, it's about place and protocols. Could you go to the next slide, please? So before I continue, I think it's important to note that all businesses must have a COVID-safe plan. Links to this can be found on our website at resources.lpc.com.au/knowledge. So I would strongly recommend that if you haven't already established a COVID-safe plan, that you go and you look at the template that's been provided by Safe Work Australia. So and to continue the process of answering this question, I will in particular look at the reoccupancy planning that we've been doing for clients, and then also make a brief comment about lifting capacity and protocols, which has been a very current hot subject. So next slide please. In last week's webinar, we answered this question in part by talking to the importance of undertaking, firstly, a risk assessment and engaging with your workers. We have represented this in a graphical format here as high, medium and low, which is the sea of red that you can see. It's important to note that it's critical that your business complete the risk assessment. Remember to talk to your workers as soon as possible. They will know and have many solutions that could be implemented as part of the COVID safe work plan. So secondly, analysis of work points using 1.5 metre physical distancing to reduce risks and arrive at an agreed utilisation is the second step that we've been applying. Next slide, please. So the third is applying the 4 square metre rule. This is our plan on a page, and what I'm going to demonstrate here is how we have overlaid the risk assessment, the 1.5 metre analysis and the square metre rule. So in scenario 1, which is taken from the plan on a page that you can see, the 1.5 metre analysis resulted in a reduction in work points from 176 to 88. And then analysing the meeting rooms by applying the 4 square metre rule as a confined space, we arrived at 16 work points. So it gave this floor a maximum capacity of 104 people based on the analysis undertaken and the risk level that the client was prepared to accept. However, if I take this same scenario and apply it to New South Wales, where there is the 100-person rule per premises, then I've actually worked this in reverse. So the maximum allowable is 100. And then we have analysed that there's 88 work points as far as occupied, which gives us only 12 positions available for visitors to the site. And by visitors, we mean that we're not necessarily suggesting that to the client, but it might be contractors or some other people's. But what's really important is that people on the premises, staff, visitors must be counted when applying the 4 square metre rule. So if we go to the next slide. In working to the answer about place and density constraints, the real elephant in the room was the question of building lifting restrictions. And up until last week, the commentary was all about, well, I might be able to accommodate 100 people on my floor, but they can't get up there. And how efficient is that going to be? Clarification has now been provided that physical distancing restrictions do not apply to lifts. The question is this a blessing or a workplace health and safety nightmare for tenants? I'll leave that with you to think about. So if we move to the next slide, then it's back to Michael.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sorry, I was the one suggesting everyone should stay on their toes and I was caught napping. Sorry about that. Look, we do have a few questions. Perhaps I'll bring Ken into the picture here.
Do you want to move to the next slide so people can see what Ken looks like?
Good looking young chap.
He's very good looking.
The question is, Ken, our lease expires in 6 months' time. What do you suggest in order to maximise our leverage if our preference is to stay and renew?
Yeah, I guess the first step, what you need is in order to create leverage, is to identify alternative options that are actually available in the marketplace. Look, what we typically do for our clients is undertake a thorough due diligence of the marketplace, just to understand what other options are available. It's like buying your first house. You never buy your first house without undertaking an assessment of what's available. And look, and following that process also, look, if it so happens that the business does actually find a suitable options, what we typically recommend, or we do for our clients, is run the 2 processes parallel, including the stay put option and the alternative option, trying to leverage or create competition between your stay put option and your alternative, the alternative option that you have on the table. And look, from our experience, that typically helps in order to get the best commercial outcome in terms of the terms and conditions that are available in the current marketplace.
Great, thanks, Ken. Rebecca, one for you. How important is it to have an audit of people count, and at what intervals?
You have to be able to register and screen all visitors to the workplace and staff, so anyone that attends the premises. And we have been working on the basis that it's continuous. So if the maximum allowable in your premises is 100 people, then you need to be counting continuously as people come and leave the premises.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Julian.
Right, Michael.
Julian.
Yes.
Does the Commercial Code of Conduct relate to the regulated periods by the states? That is, in New South Wales, can relief only be agreed for the period 24 April through the 24 October, or is this subject to good faith negotiations?
Yeah, look, the mandated response is in relation to that period, and that period has regard to JobKeeper in many respects, even though it's not aligned, but it's for 6 months. But the answer is it's a negotiated outcome, and I think it's fair to say we were all affected in March onwards, or not all, but the majority of affected tenants were affected in March. So the period from 24th of April was really probably 6 weeks after the affected period, and the good faith discussions need to have regard to the affected period. Yeah.
Thanks, Julian. Rebecca, just back to you again. How do I perform a continuous count? At the exit's entrance?
So what we've been nominating on the plan on a page that we've been doing is that we have one registration and screening point on the floor. So all staff and visitors have to enter that one point, and then they have to leave that one point. So it's continuous.
Yep.
And we don't have multiple exits. So that's why it's important. It's not only overlaying physical requirements, overlaying protocols. So staff have to understand the importance of, the maximum number of people per floor, registering, leaving the premises, and following the protocols.
Okay, great. Thank you. Understood. Ken, be interested to hear this one. Do you anticipate the office market conditions to change post-COVID-19? In particular, the rental levels and the incentive levels?
Well, thanks, Michael. It's a good question. Look, certainly the office market isn't going to be the same post-COVID. Look, based on our experience, we anticipate there to be a number of sublease opportunities that will come online post-COVID, which will in turn apply pressure on rent and incentive levels. What we're experiencing at the moment, deals that we've negotiated for our clients pre-COVID, and we're in the process of renegotiating the deals to take into account the current COVID situation. And I do have to say the rents have dropped and incentives have increased. So we do expect an increase in incentives and a drop in face rents.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. Few more. Got quite a few. I'm getting overwhelmed. Rebecca, again, obviously you're piquing the interest of people. How do you control the flow of people if everyone is entering and exiting from a single point?
Look, there's obviously many ways to do that. And so one is establishing protocols that are communicated to staff. We've been using a plan on a page, which is distributed to staff as part of that communications. We, no different to you going through the checkout at Woolies or Coles, is that you stand in a queue, the markers are separated at 1.5 metres, and it has to then be policed. So it's a layered response.
Right. Okay.
Did that answer, Michael? You think that answered the question?
I think so. It seems that there's a particular point of interest with this particular question. So perhaps they could even contact you directly. Details are on the screen. But Rebecca, there's another one for you. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
We share base building bathrooms with other tenants on our floor. How can I protect my staff from when they're using those facilities? That's a good question.
Okay. Look, I think it's a very, from the research, the two high-risk areas are particularly shared areas. So, for example, bathrooms and also obviously kitchen amenities and spaces. So I think the issue here is identifying the risks, highlighting that, and then having a conversation with the building manager about what protocols and controls they're going to put in place to address that concern. There's obviously also the added enhancements that you can have for staff as they come and leave your premises, but I think that it's worthwhile identifying it as a risk and then tabling that with your landlord and asking for their response.
Okay. Jump in on this one because it could be any one of you. Have you done staff surveys? What's the appetite to return to work? What percentage of staff want to return versus not want to return?
Maybe I can jump in initially.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, we had an interesting case earlier this week where we assisted in getting the workplace ready for reoccupancy, and surveys were issued last week by the tenant to all their staff, circa 250 people. 5 people turned up on the Monday. So I think there is a level of people being comfortable at home now, and so it'll be interesting to see whether some departments are forced back or A and B teams initially. But in my opinion, and Rebecca might have add additional comment, it's got to be a phased return. It can't all be in one go, so it needs to be phased, and for the workplace itself, but also for the building.
So a lot of our clients are piloting their return to work. So establishing a plan as a pilot, and then that plan will probably evolve and adapt and change as lessons are learnt and issues and comfort levels are addressed through process and protocol. So I think it's a phased entry with lessons to be learnt along the way.
Okay. Another question's just popped up. The impact of COVID-19 on lease rates must be starting to impact the sector. Is there any visible change to the rates per square metre yet? Perhaps, Ken, you were touching upon that.
Yeah, look, an example I'll probably use is just the deal we negotiated pre-COVID, like maintaining confidentiality. We've probably seen a decrease in probably about somewhere between 3% to 5% in terms of the face rent, but the incentive levels have increased. So overall, the gross effective, there has been a significant decrease in the gross effective rental. Look, for those of you who don't understand what the gross effective rental is, it's just the difference between the headline rent that's noted on the lease after the deduction of the incentive. But we are starting to see a significant change even in terms of the deal structures also. Landlords are probably more willing to come to the table compared to pre-COVID.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I think just one final question has just popped up. Where there is no capacity for one-way path through the office, do you have any suggestions for safe team member movement? Rebecca.
Where there is no capacity for one-way path?
Yeah, yes.
So what we have been doing, this typical situation that we have is where there's not capacity for two-way directional, so bi-directional travel, and we have been nominating single directional travel. Typically, we will take it from, we start the path from the entry point, so the registration and screening point, and we will take that in a clockwise direction for the priority pathways, and then the secondary pathways have to give way to the primary pathway. Then there's, and obviously this is where you can put in place protocols, but people also have to be very pragmatic with how they resolve, you know, these minor sort of issues, or where there is potential for conflict, and that is that somebody gives way to somebody else. So have a headline protocol, establish it, sign it, communicate it, and then secondary protocols to support where you can't apply those models.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Look, we've run out of time. Look, we very much appreciate the response and the number of questions we received, but we do have a limited amount of time. But look, again, I emphasise that if you do want to ask questions, please feel free to contact any of us, and we'll be more than happy to oblige. But look, that brings our session to a close. We trust that today's session sheds light on what is a dynamic and really complex situation. So thank you to Julian, Ken and Rebecca on some really expert advice. Please join us at the same time next week for our next webinar in this series. The guys will again be tackling part 3, Julian specifically, part 3 of his the revolution of lease arrangements during and post COVID-19. And Rebecca will start on the 3rd part of her discussion, but we have thought we'd call it the no place workplace revolution. So that will be very interesting. In the meantime, if you have any further questions, as I suggested or alluded to earlier, please don't hesitate to contact us. And finally, all of today's attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording of this webinar. So please feel free to share that or with colleagues. And thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon. Stay safe. And we look forward to joining you again next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.